Welcome to the webinar Realigning German International Cooperation Perspectives from Ghana and Senegal, convened by the Economy and Society Program of the Africa Policy Research Institute, APRI. My name is Joshua Kwesi Akins. I'm a senior fellow at APRI, the head of the Economy and Society Program, and I'm your host for today. As expert authors and discussants, we are privileged to have Dr. Sokhna Ndiaye of LASPAD, Bright Simmons, Honorary Vice President of Imani and President of Pedigree. And as a discussant, we have Dr. Bernhard Braune, Head of the Division West Africa 1 Sahel at the German Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation. Now, before I introduce each of our eminent guests in more detail, and before I give them the floor, I'd like to briefly sketch out the rationale and the motivation for convening this webinar at this time. So, why this webinar and why now? We are convening this webinar because recent government changes in Senegal, Ghana, and Germany, in our view, open up possibilities for realigning relationships and cooperation. We've commissioned experts in Senegal and Ghana to analyze how the recent elections and changes of government of all these three countries might open up policy space to make targeted changes in the Ghanaian-German and also Senegalese-German relationships and cooperation. These inquiries were commissioned in the context of Germany and others routinely praising Ghanaian and Senegalese democracy. We wanted to know, how could a substantive follow-up and realignment based on this appreciation actually look like? Right? So we have bilateral consultations between Germany and Senegal, as well as Germany and Ghana coming up this autumn. So now is the right time to actually engage in conversations such as this one. The authors were asked to address the following questions, among others. They were asked to identify possible changes, right? So the question was, what are key policy changes or other conducive activities Germany could undertake to actually increase policy space and therefore democratic space for these and with these new governments? We asked also for prioritization. Which of these options would be most impactful, in which way, and why? We also wanted to know about political agency and contradictions, right? So we asked, what are the key changes and trade-offs associated with these options for both the German and the Senegalese and Ghanaian governments? And we also requested the authors that they identify impediments, which sectoral or parochial interests, which internal contradictions might be impeding aspects of change, and how could interest coalitions be formed to enable change. So both papers offer timely analyses and concise policy options. They offer pathways for actually reshaping bilateral cooperation in a fast-changing global context that requires new modes of partnership. This very webinar that we're having now is also an opportunity to foster strategic thinking about such realignments. The papers are actually in the late draft stage at this point, and the authors are invited to take on board any aspects of today's discussion that they might find germane and relevant to their overall analysis, which is then to be published late this or early next month. So this means that you, the audience, is invited to contribute to the discussion via questions you can ask via the YouTube chat function to the right of the video window. The event actually offers a rare opportunity to engage in policy-focused debate about the future shape of German international cooperation as Germany steps into a new role as the world's largest bilateral donor, while debates about the need to reshape international cooperation intensify. So with that, allow me to now introduce the speakers in the order of their contribution today. So first, we have Dr. Sokhna Rosalie Ndiaye. She is an assistant professor of public and social policy at the Université Rose for Senegal, where she is currently the head of the Division for Research and Scientific Cooperation. She's also the scientific director for the Axis New Social Dynamics at l'ASPAT, Laboratoire d'analyse des sociétés et pouvoirs Afrique Diaspora. Her research interests include policymaking and governance, social movements and democracy, as well as life course trajectories in low-income countries. Through her research, Sokhna aims to contribute to policymaking that helps alleviate social inequalities affecting young people in the global south. So welcome, Sokhna. Our second speaker is Bright Simmons. He's the Honorary Vice President of Imani and the President of M-Pedigree. M-Pedigree is a social enterprise working on 3 continents to transform supply chains for life-touching products such as medicines and agro-inputs using technology and partnerships. M-Pedigree has secured billions of products from counterfeiting and protected tens of millions of consumers around the world. Bright is, however, also an ardent policy activist, working at the interface of economic governance and social welfare in pursuit of these causes. He has served as a member of the External Advisory Board of European biopharma company UCB, as vice chair of the APRI, the African Population and Health Research Center, and as a member of the boards of Salzburg Global and Care International, as well as several other positions. He was an inaugural TED Fellow, and he has held the Cheng and Mallincroft Fellowships at Harvard. He is a Thalberg Eliasson Prize Laureate, recipient of the Lifetime Achievement Award from the African Innovation Foundation, and has written for Harvard Business Review, Quartz Magazine, BBC's Business Daily, and others. He was recently awarded a Bellagio Fellowship where he focused on the problems of the mineral supply chain, advancing a new equitable circular economy protocol for green minerals critical to the energy transition. So with that, a very warm welcome to you, Bright. Now, our discussant for today is Dr. Bernhard Braune. He is the head of division at the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development for the division Sahel West Africa 1. The scope of this role includes, among others, the German engagement with 10 West African states, as well as the donor platform for the region Sahel Alliance. Early assignments included the head of division for global health policy, head of division on return and reintegration issues, senior advisor to the Secretary of State of the Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development, and head of development cooperation at the German Embassy in Dakar, Senegal. Dr. Braune holds a law degree from the Free University of Berlin, a master's degree in comparative and international law from the University of Stockholm, and a PhD in public international law, also from the Free University of Berlin. So a very warm welcome to you, Dr. Braune. Right. So with all that said, with our eminent speakers introduced, I would now like to actually give the floor to our first speaker, Dr. Sokhna Ndiaye.
Thank you very much, Kwesi. Thank you for the introductions. I will just share my screen. Since the introductions are already done, I guess we can move on to the topic of the day. Well, regarding my part of the presentation, I will be speaking of rethinking Senegalese-German cooperation in an era of global realignment. So I'm presenting as a disclaimer, as you have said, this is the late stages of the draft of our policy brief that I have worked on with Dr. Selly, who's also a part of LASPAD. And basically, our reflection is articulated around a very simple premise, a very simple question. It is to question given the long-standing relationship between Germany and Senegal, and given the current situation in the region and the situation globally speaking, even the realignments that are operating at a global level, how can both Senegal and Germany move beyond symbolic gestures to build a truly mutually beneficial partnership that is truly equitable, co-owned, co-constructed, and transformative. And our findings are evolving, as I have said, because we have spoken to development experts from both sides, government officials, etc., that have helped us structure and understand what the situation is between these two countries. But through our initial thoughts, we have based our initial thoughts on the elements that you have cited earlier, Kwesi, which are to identify the possible changes, priorities, etc. So for the first point, when we speak of the key policy changes that could help increase the policy space for both Senegal and Germany. I'm not speaking only of Senegal because it is evident, as you have said, that Germany is now proposed in from a bilateral perspective as the largest bilateral donor, but it still remains tied to, for example, the Team Europe, Team Europe. It still remains, its policy space is still within a specific setting. So we also need to think about how its role in those settings affects its bilateral relationship with its partners. So based on our analysis, we believe that the core idea is to build a true partnership, as I was saying earlier, that is co-constructed, but especially context-driven. Context-driven in the sense that the Senegalese authorities that we were able to speak to expressed how important the relationship with Germany is to them. But this relationship needs to be based upon mutually beneficial points, so to say. So that we should, from both sides, we should go beyond and move beyond the donor-recipient relationship that has always been the basis of cooperation, whether it is between Senegal and Germany or Senegal and its other partners, but to move beyond this mindset. The positive or the basis of the relationship between these two countries is a positive aspect of it is that, so to say, there is no colonial past between the two countries. So it has been really based from the beginning on a very organic, a very friendly relationship, and it was always based on assistance that was quite often not conditional in a sense, so to say. So first is to shift from this donor-recipient relationship to a more equal approach to partnership, which is crucial. Second, to address structural inequalities, and this is in decision-making mechanisms, trade imbalances, and needs-based interventions. I will just quickly move to the second slide because I've talked about trade imbalances. So this is just the data that I retrieved from the World Bank Data Lab this morning, which shows, and this is not Senegal-Germany, it's just Senegal's percentage, import-export percentages of its GDP. So we can see that Senegal has been steadily experiencing trade imbalances where it exports less goods, so it imports more goods than it exports. And addressing these structural inequalities, Germany could help, in this sense, dismantle the institutionalized structural inequalities that constrain Senegal's policy autonomy. And this include reevaluating the imbalanced trade relationship between the two countries, and to move beyond prioritizing the German domestic concerns in aid programs. It is true that often when we spoke to partners, we see that obviously there are consultations, obviously there are deliberations, and there are negotiations, but it remains that Senegal is still at the recipient end of the spectrum, so it has to align in a certain manner to the priorities that are somewhat not imposed but suggested to it. And the next point would be to tailor more to more technical and vocational training. There are many initiatives that exist. The GIZ is doing a lot in Senegal in this manner. But the fact of the matter is that Senegal is experiencing a very difficult, very sensitive financial situation at this point, which might impact the effectiveness, the efficiency of the interventions being conducted in one or another sector. So this is something to keep in mind. We go more in detail about these points in the draft. And to address the elephant in the room, the current debt situation in Senegal. Um, we have, well, the fact of the matter is Senegal's debt is alarming. It's at a 919%, I mean, 119% ratio of its compared to its GDP, and it's just alarming. It could be alarming for for its creditors. It is alarming for investors. So this is if we speak of prioritization, which is the second point of this reflection. Debt restructuring is actually the first point that comes to mind at this point in time, because this is arguably the most immediate and impactful measure that Germany, in consultation with Senegal, could undertake. This high debt burden will severely constrain its fiscal space. But to be more positive, the fact that the government has been very transparent about this is perhaps a point that could limit the risks associated with such high debt, which could borderline be called a debt crisis. Because to begin, we had officially declared a 79%, if I'm not wrong, of the percentage of debt. Then it was raised to 98%, and then upon further investigation from the audit courts of Senegal, we found out that there was a hidden debt that was not declared by the previous authorities. So the fact that the new government, these new authorities, are very transparent, very plain point blank period about, hey, this is our situation, we are willing to do something about it, please help us. And this shows that it's willing to not repeat the errors of the past, so to say. So immediately what could be done by the two countries would be to reflect on strategies for relief or restructuring that could free up resources and directly increase policy space and allow for the government to address pressing national issues, national priorities, because poverty is on the rise in Senegal. Because of this debt situation, Senegal has been constrained to, has had to cut some of its subsidies to families who are suffering from this situation. So this is something that could directly empower not only the fiscal space of Senegal, but also the democratic decision making by giving the government more control over its budget. And we have already mentioned in terms of policy change, but this is also a priority, is to redefine the partnership mechanisms. I would like to say that Germany really is advanced in terms of being inclusive of its partners in this sense, even in Senegal. And this is the impression that we have gotten when we have spoken to the different people that we have spoken to. But it is also part of, as I was saying, Team Europe, and it is also in a setting that might constrain it in in its approach, basically. So when strategies are co-constructed, and we believe and we insist that this is important, that they are at the whole cycle of the policy making, Senegalese authorities are consulted and their opinions taken into account, this would naturally expand Senegal's policy space. And this will build, in return, trust and mutual respect, which are essential for long-term cooperation. And again, it's about the third priority, rebalancing structural economic inequalities. And in this sense, maybe Germany could help work to open fairer markets. I was speaking of the import-export situation. So support Senegalese value chains, encourage FDIs, private investments in sectors that are important for the country's development, for the country to develop its internal economy. So it's the agro-industry, the infrastructure, manufacturing. And when it comes to energy partnership, because I think energy partnership is right now a very important both for Senegal and for Germany. So instead of just focusing on fossil fuels, Germany could partner with Senegal. There are some initiatives already, but they are quite sparse on solar energy, on supporting wind energy, etc. But there could be a reflection to identify the national needs and make it a nationwide initiative. And this would also involve investing in technological transfer and train a new generation of green skilled workers. Also, take migration as an opportunity. I remember reading an article maybe a month ago about how Germany needed about 500,000 skilled workers. I think Dr. Brauner could highlight or could emphasize whether this is a correct number or not. But migration is an opportunity for both Germany and Senegal. Senegal has a pool of young people who are trained, who are actually trained, but struggle to find employment. And these are thousands of people. And these are the same people that will take the illegal migration routes. So I believe we have the human resources. Germany needs the human resources. Why not tap into our pool of resources? That could be a solution. And this would, in turn, all of these points would in turn profoundly impact Senegal's ability, because the new government talks a lot about endogeneity, so self-financing. So these are some ways where we could help develop help strengthen internal capabilities, capacitating Senegal to pursue independent policy choices. And again, the trade imbalances, I think it's important to reevaluate also the conditionalities in aid programs. This would also help free up resources and reduce dependencies. I showed this already. So the key changes and trade-offs that we were invited to reflect upon. So I divided them between Germany and Senegal. So key changes, how these changes might affect Germany in a sense, it's that it would need to reconsider its traditional role and approach to development cooperation, moving away from this donor-centric mindset, and it would require greater flexibility and a willingness to share decision-making power. This is at the lowest level all the way to the macro levels, because the people that we have been able to speak to are do agree that Germany is quite advanced in its hierarchical model, but there are still areas where it's still quite bureaucratic, quite traditional in a sense. So this would require greater flexibility, as I said, and a willingness to share. And the trade-offs would be, if we consider the debt situation, debt relief would have direct financial costs, obviously. But the positive side of this is that the funds invested in turn might yield better returns. If we are not concerned just about servicing debt, then we can focus on investing in what is really important for the country's development. Another trade-off would be the reduction of direct influence. So letting go might be perceived as a reduction of the direct influence that Germany might have over project implementation and policy direction in Senegal. But it's not really a trade-off if we consider that there are other mechanisms that actually don't give Senegal complete autonomy. So if I take the example of the budget support that is given to Senegal by Germany, that is directly injected into the budget, this is bilateral. But if we take the setting of compact with Africa, which calls for I don't know if I can call it a conditionality, but basically you have to implement reforms to be able to use these funds. So the bilateral is very overtly unconditional, but then you have other mechanisms that can put conditions as to how you can use the funds you actually have. So the money, in a sense, or the funds are still reform and sector driven. Um, what else? So if I take from the Senegalese government's perspective, key changes would be that the new Senegalese government is more positive for us, obviously, would gain greater policy space and autonomy, and this would empower it to pursue its own development agenda more freely, especially with reduced debt burdens, and it would also need to, but on the other hand, it would need to step up and embrace more fully the responsibilities that would come with this increased decision-making power. And this would require to very clearly articulate its needs and priorities on immediately and in the long term. And the trade-offs would be increased accountability is not negative at all. With greater autonomy and fiscal space would come increased responsibility and accountability to its own citizens, but also to its creditors for the successes and failures of policy. And this requires increased transparency, which we believe there are on the right track of doing it, as we have seen. And also managing expectations. So the government would need to manage both internal and external expectations regarding the pace and the nature of its new cooperation model, especially when it concerns the freeing up of resources that will be utilized. And the last trade-off would be that while Germany is a key partner to Senegal, this increased autonomy would mean navigating relationships with a wider array of international actors, whether public or private, and balancing different interests at the same time, which has proven and can prove to be very complicated. So I don't know how much time I have left, Kwesi, but just to
Yeah, it would be good if you could
just
come
wrap up.
with the next 2 minutes. Yes, please.
Okay, great. So potential impediments, so the financial interest, so the debt holding, the resistance to change, and the regional repositioning of Germany now as a financial superpower in the bilateral sense. The potential impediments for Senegal is risk avoidance because those who benefit from aid and the debt structure might not be so open to these drastic changes. Dependency, there would be maybe resistance to taking full responsibility and self-direct development in the immediate time. And internally, the balancing of various external partners, the challenges of the diversification, forming interest coalitions. I believe there should be more involvement from academics. This is not self-publicity, but it's important to include more academics in the conversation, more private sector engagement between the different governments that could have avoided what we have seen with the hidden debt, to include youth groups, economic actors, the policy experts who advocate for autonomy and justice. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Sokhna, for these insights. And yeah, I can just share that this is already based on a rather, broad swath of conversations. Uh, and I think it's clear that as we're approaching autumn, as you said, it's important to widen the scope of those whose expertise can actually be brought to the table. But thank you for this very erudite analysis. I would like to invite the audience before we move on to Bright Simmons's presentation. Please do not hold back with any questions you might have. The way this is structured is that we will now hear Bright Simmons and we will hear Bernard Brauner's response to both presentations. We will then have a brief panel discussion and then we'll move on to the audience, questions. However, that doesn't mean that you have to hold back. Please feel free to write whatever question or comment you want to share in the YouTube chat immediately as they occur to you. Right. So with that invitation, I would now like to give the floor to Bright Simmons for his presentation on Ghanaian-German relations.
Thank you very much, Kwesi. And like Dr. Ndiaye, I also saw that this canvas that we're giving was very broad. The scope and span of German-Ghanaian relationship, it's truly extensive. So what I'm going to do is to focus on a very narrow segment of the opportunity. And I'm going to be focusing primarily on the strategic options and particularly a way forward that I propose. And even that will not save me from attempting to simplify too much and to compress too much, but at least it will make it more coherent. So this concept of policy impatience will be explained later, as well as the mixed speed concept. And like I've pointed out, if you want to discuss Ghana-German relationships over the span of our history of cooperation, you are completely spoiled for choice. There's so much you can talk about. So this focus will be primarily on what we think are kind of key elements of that relationships. But that nonetheless, it's important that we put that in context. And so I will give you a very quick overview of the German-Ghanaian relationship as it's evolved, starting from colonial times. Those of you that have followed the history of Germany's presence in Africa know that this was a primarily Brandenburger affair until much later that unified Germany became much more important in the scheme of affairs. It was also it's important to point to the fact that German colonial economic engagement with Africa was always very skills focused. So there's always been this element of skills and technical capacity as an important element. Then you move to sometimes in the 50s all the way to 66 when the first president was removed. And then you have supply credits and development loans become very critical and important. And that continues. KfW comes into the picture and that continues. And you see that in the 80s and the 90s, again, technical and vocational skills become prominent again. And then we move into the 2017 to 2015, 2025 time frame when compared with Africa, Economic Partnership Arrangement, DBG, and different elements come to the fore. And some of those new opportunities will form the basis of the recommendations that I will give. So in summary, you have the colonial era with mission enterprises, with trading houses, skills, and the likes of those things. Then the new phase in the early post-independence era in Ghana, when supplier credits and development loans take a very strong position in the whole canvas. Then you move on to technical and vocational education, beginning to assert itself. Then, Germany's switch towards the green economy agenda start to have an effect on the relationship. And then the new attempt to create these, global programs like EU Global Gateway, compared with Africa and the like. I also give you a little bit of an example of the key archetypes for each of these things. I'm not going to go into great detail because we don't have the time, but it's important as we move on that we recognize the very interesting heterogeneity of the interventions, the way in which they balance each other out. And some of that will become apparent as I move to the key elements of the analysis. So when you look at the different instruments that have been available to Germany in the cooperation journey, and you think through, mission trade enterprises, supplier credits, loans, technical assistance, etc., you begin to get a dynamic in terms of a growing number of intensity of all of these different instruments, which is a good thing. So the heterogeneity of the relationship has intensified. There's more that Germany is doing in an attempt to use multiple instruments, more so than in the past. And that is naturally interesting. But I will say that, and here I'll start to narrow down dramatically. I will say that as far as this talk is concerned, we are interested in primarily two things. One is supplier credits and its contribution to industrialization in Ghana. And the second is technical and vocational education and training, which is basically the skills platform. And I start off from the early pre-independence period to the early post-independence period in Ghana. And there, I think the supplier credit element, where Germany became just behind the United Kingdom, the largest provider of supplier credits to Ghana, and the impact that had on industrialization is an important starting point for the analysis going forward. So the point is what changed, what has evolved since then. But for those who are not familiar with what I mean by export credits, this is a very quick explanation using a real transaction. So you have a German exporter, typically exporting capacity. So this could be equipment, this could be digital capabilities, whatever it is. And then you have a German bank that is the arranger. You have the borrower on the Ghanaian side, and that can be private sector. It doesn't always have to be the government. It doesn't always be a sovereign borrowing. And then you have a guarantee provider, typically Euler Hermes, which in Germany is very interesting. So it's a private company, but the German government has this very elaborate arrangement with it that allows it to provide export credits overseas in ways that are quite interesting for those of you that want to learn further. So essentially, the German government, by incentivizing the transfer of technology, in this particular instance, through the provision of guarantees, enable Ghana to industrialize by absorbing this technology into its industry. And if you go back to the First Republic, which I started off with, you realize that you look at the Ghanaian master plan for industrialization, some of the key master plans, a German company called Stahl Union in those days was responsible for nearly 40% of the capacity building that went into these industrial projects. So essentially providing the actual factories, building these factories and providing the equipment and the likes of it. It was very interesting to note that Germany's capitation or capacitation in the early post-independence period was that pronounced even back then. So now we move to the present and we look at the bilateral strategic environment, what is happening between Germany and Ghana, very similar to what Dr. Ndiaye did, but in my case, very narrowed down to Ghana's current flagship policy, which is the 24-hour economy program. And the 24-hour economy program is this attempt by the Ghanaian government, the new Ghanaian government, to utilize to the fullest maximum all of Ghana's underutilized capacity. And it's not surprising when you put it that way that manufacturing becomes very important, because one of the, even if you don't know a lot about Africa and its economic trajectory, one of the more common issues has been the deindustrialization. Danny Roderick calls it the premature deindustrialization of Africa. It's much more complicated than that, but we don't have the time for all the nuances. So all I will say is that if you track Africa's share of global manufacturing value add, it peaks in 1970. And then since 1970, it's been declining. There's been an upward swing again from 2000s, which is a very interesting subtrend. But after COVID, we are seeing again another downward trend. So that really truly is basically Africa's manufacturing story. And Ghana's manufacturing story is a bit more roller coaster, a bit more hectic, but it's not that different. It also peaks just after the 1970s, dramatically declined by 1980 when Ghana had its lost decade, went back up, then flattened from the 2000s, got a boost from oil. And now what you've seen from the 2020 onwards is that oil in Ghana has peaked. So basically the fossil fuel boost has peaked. And because the fossil fuel boost has peaked, Ghana needs a new growth pole, essentially. So that's the situation on the Ghana side. On the Germany side, on the German side, we must simplify by describing the situation in Germany now as future anxiety. There is within German society an increasing worry about the future of Germany. And part of this is to do with declining industrial output in some sectors in which Germany was a world leader. So if you think of the ongoing boom in AI chips, the Netherlands is there, Taiwan is there. There are different players in Germany, sorry, the US and China that are playing a role. Certainly, Germany is not there, which is surprising, given Germany's past as an industrial powerhouse. It's surprising that Germany doesn't make AI chips, for instance. But if you look at people's expectations in Germany, the people's personal futures, and you ask them, and you compare that to even France, which is typically often called the segment of Europe in some respects, you get surprisingly more pessimistic views in Germany than in France. So that's very surprising to look at that. And obviously, I've talked about new enterprise formation, which is basically often an indicator of innovation, is also significantly down in Germany compared to France and the US, for example. So there is this whole new talk about how you revitalize Germany. I think McKinsey has done quite well in coming up with this whole lift and share, shift and lift strategy that talks about Germany rediscovering its global influence as far as cutting edge technology is concerned, and then thinking about domains in cutting edge technology where Germany can reassert its global leadership. And when you look at that, from between now and 2035, there has to be a sea change in the way Germany sees itself, definitely. And the capabilities that Germany is able to put to bear will be hugely critical. And you look at the distribution of areas that are important, new battery technology, Internet of Things, robotics. These are huge potential growth pools for Germany. And I'll talk about why that is important in the context of this particular conversation again. So now we go back to the other dimensions. So I've talked about, obviously, the export credit story in the past and how it was very linked to industrialization, how it was central to Ghana's industrialization. I've talked about the bilateral issues, what in each country is a big facet of what's going on. And I've explained that in both Ghana and Germany, there is this manufacturing industrialization conversation, but in very different ways. So in Germany, it's about rediscovering the edge. In Ghana, it's really about maintaining momentum after many lost decades in manufacturing. So now I come back to this technical and vocational educational training term, which Dr. Ndiaye also mentioned is significant in Senegal. It's significant very much in Ghana. I think this is the German platform. I think everywhere Germany goes, technical and vocational skills goes with it. And it's not surprising, therefore, that in Ghana, Germany is by far the leader when it comes to vocational and technical education and skills provision across the country. Now, when you look at the cooperation heat map between Ghana and Germany, you'll also see that TVET is the biggest, technical vocational education and training and the skills that makes available. And there is this, connection between TVET, technical and vocational skills and industrialization. I mean, it's unsurprising. If you think of someone in a factory, what do they need to know in a factory? If you think of a welder, if you think of someone that is operating in an automotive setting, naturally, technical and vocational skills will be quite important. And there is evidence, there is empirical evidence that technical and vocational skills generate capabilities which correspond quite significantly with manufacturing value add. And there is also, even when you look at the partial share of TVET alone, quite a significant implication when it comes to manufacturing value add and GDP. So there is no dispute. However, here's what it gets interesting. Things have changed. In the past, broad-based capabilities developed from technical and vocational skills was extremely critical as a platform that enabled industrialization then to proceed. So if you think of Japanese industrialization, if you think of British industrialization, German industrialization, you needed to spread these capabilities across the economy. And then somehow, in an integrated fashion, manufacturing developed. And then as manufacturing developed and really advanced, high-value services layered on top of that made manufacturing more profitable. So many people are not aware of this, but in many parts of the world now, services, high-value service, about 50% of manufacturing outputs. And in some instances, the high-value services component is about 75% of profitability. So basically, to keep manufacturing on the edge, you need high-value services. But high-value services come after manufacturing. And this is the classic picture. So you build the advanced manufacturing platform, and on top of that, your design, your R&D, all of these high-value service layers on top of that. And that boosts productivity, which then boosts profitability and allows you to uplift manufacturing back again. So the problem you're seeing with the malaise in Germany is due to the fact that high-value services have shrunk in certain respects. And so your ability to move Germany to AI, some of these domains have become more challenging. But the problem is that there's a competing model. And that competing model is that you don't do broad-based capabilities first. You go spearhead. You focus on specific sectors and you go really hard and you uplift that capital. And so you look at China, and China has amazing leadership in some areas. Shipping. No country in the world comes close to China in shipping. But China is really, really weak in avionics. A lot of Chinese aviation success, aerospace success, has come about because by trade liberalization, it's acquired high-value components from America. But China is not very good when it comes to high-end avionics. China is not very good when it comes to high-end fabrication equipment for chips either. The Netherlands is very advanced because of companies like ASML. China is not. What that means, therefore, is that China did not really wait for broad-based capabilities in the way that Japan and Germany did. What they've done is spearheaded sectors. They've put a lot of capital in certain areas and moved to the top of the global hierarchy in those areas and to the global cutting edge in those areas, even as it really lacks certain capabilities. So the spearhead model creates this impatience issue that I mentioned in the title page. The impatience is that in certain respects, industrialization nowadays is that countries move very quickly to the global frontier where they have the cost of capital, the capital capabilities to do so. They don't wait for broad-based capabilities first. So waiting for TVET, technical vocational skills to spread across the economy, and then that somehow will generate a manufacturing platform, will then generate high-level, high-value services. It's no longer the classic picture that we used to see. Countries like Taiwan, countries like China, countries like Korea have shown a different direction. And this is this whole targeted, spearheaded, impatient industrialization clustering effect that we're beginning to realize. So the spearhead cases mean that countries in Africa, I think, don't have the patience. I don't think they have the institutional environment to enable broad-based capabilities development first before they industrialize. They just don't have it. And Ghana certainly doesn't have it. So that gives us a few different strategic options. And that means embedding the capabilities into a new spearhead strategy, which is what we call vanguardism. Focus on vanguards. And if you focus on vanguards, both in Germany and in Africa, both in Europe and in Africa, both in Germany and in Ghana, you have some of these opportunities that we're beginning to see. Siemens doing work with Gridco, enabling green energy to be better evacuated and dispatched. Things like that don't necessarily require broad-based capability to come first, but you spearhead, you move into areas where you can do really, really interesting work on the cutting edge, you move to the global frontier, and you get this done. And our argument is that this also aligns with the geostrategic environment. Within the geostrategic environment nowadays, does not favor broad-based capability diffusion. It favors spearheading. It favors policy impatience. It favors the ability to jump to the global frontier. And we think that, my view is very strongly that if Germany is saying that, look, Africa is very well behind, we have to lift Africa by the shoelaces, steadily and uniformly, we will miss the opportunity. It's anisotropic. So that anisotropy means that it's directionally dependent. And that directional dependency allows you to focus on spearhead opportunities. And that is exactly the kind of strategic option that will make it possible for Germany and Ghana to align behind the vision of the future. And I think when it comes to the trade-offs and those kinds of things, it's obvious that if you decide to spearhead, then you don't do broad base. That really is the main trade-off. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Bright, for your presentation, which I believe has also spearheaded a different way of actually framing how we can discuss the very idea of realigning interests and strategic horizons for such discussions. And so thank you for that. With that, I would now like to invite Dr. Bernhard Braune for a first response, a reaction to what has just been shared.
Super. Thank you so much, colleagues, partly for moderating, for inviting me to this seminar, and for discussing with our distinguished speakers and colleagues new ways forward to improve German development cooperation. Maybe allow me one or two general remarks on what BMZ currently is reflecting on internally. As you rightly pointed out, we are under a new government in Germany, some 3 months in the business, but certainly with a reform agenda that also touches on the international engagement of Germany, and of course then BMZ as the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development is part of that international setting of the federal government. So we are very much looking into our own setup. And as I said, I'm happy to share some of these elements. But to do that more informed, of course, these outside views on our development cooperation are extremely helpful. So thank you for that. Then maybe a minor note up front. As you rightly pointed out, I'm heading the West Africa 1 section, which includes Senegal, but I'm not responsible for the Ghana program myself. So I'm happy to share some of the remarks from the colleague who read the paper, but allow me to be a little bit more brief when I speak about Ghana. So briefly on the reform process and what we are looking at. We have very conflicting trends. Even though the BMZ budget is dramatically decreasing, all of a sudden we are the biggest by number, by financial volume, the largest bilateral donor. That is not self-explanatory, but it has to do with the crisis of international development cooperation overall. Maybe most dramatically, that crisis becomes clear when we look at the US and the complete disappearance of USAID for political reasons, obviously linked to President Trump. Now, apparently, there is in the political spectrum the belief that international aid as such is not effective, and that is not good for the recipient, nor is it good for the donor. We can debate, by the way, these terms, but for the sake of simplicity, I will use them. So I think international aid comes, and also we can discuss the term aid. We don't use it in the German terminology anymore, but I think internationally aid has still sort of the reference terminology. So it comes under pressure from two sides. From the far right political spectrum, and it comes also under pressure from sovereignist field in our partner countries, not only on the African continent, but also in other countries. So the question is, to put it very simple, what are we doing wrong? Or are we doing things well, but don't communicate about it? And I think there is a twofold answer to that. Yes, we communicate badly what we do. And to be frank here, it reflects a little bit also in the papers that apparently what we do needs really to be researched very actively. And that shouldn't be the case. We should be more forward in our own transparency. That's why I would like to point out that on the BMZ homepage of the ministry, you will find all project data on all bilateral projects by country, by sector, by year, because we believe in the International Aid Transparency Initiative, IATI. And so there's a full database available online. So we try to be as transparent as possible, but transparency is something different than communication. And that is something that we definitely need to be better at. So International development cooperation comes under stress from two sides. We need to do better. We need to explain better what we do and how we do it. And maybe let me, if I have more time, reflect a little bit on Sokhna's analysis. And Jeff, thank you for pointing that out. We read the paper with great interest here at BNZ, and we means also my colleague Michael, who's in the call. He's the responsible desk officer, and he would be happy to have a follow-up conversation to explain in more detail later on what we're doing. But maybe let me focus on 3 points: debt, trade, and energy. The debt crisis is really severe in Senegal, and we are, as Sokhna rightly pointed out, a partner in financing directly into the budget support, budget aid. We use the term reform finance because it is linked to internal reform processes. So we are using an instrument in our financial cooperation that is the most advanced instrument that we can use, that has the highest degree of trust in the partner government's internal systems and reporting and transparency. But of course, we are a little bit in a crisis when we realize that the debt is so much higher than we had expected. However, we fully acknowledge that it's the new government that takes responsibility for the errors of the old government, and therefore we stand 100% at the side of the new government in cleaning up the mess, to use on technical terms. Would debt restructuring be helpful in that context? A clear maybe. However, Sokhna also pointed out that foreign direct investment is of key interest to the country. And of course, if you want to attract foreign direct investment, the debt restructuring would actually means cutting international debt. It needs to be carefully balanced. I think the way out is a very clear and transparent financial restructuring plan with the international partners, which the Senegalese government is already underway of discussing with us. Maybe on trade, we also fully believe that it would be positive if Senegal could participate more on the international trade. We understand, of course, that at the moment that strategy is directed at energy, which leads me to the other topic that I wanted to speak about. We are already heavily invested in renewable energy, contrary maybe, or in balancing the Senegalese national priority on oil and gas. And there is the international process on fostering renewable energy. It's called JETP, Just Energy Transition Partnership, and Germany is co-leading this process. And we are investing with financial cooperation and technical cooperation. So I think there a follow-up conversation would be very useful in order to understand what we are already doing and where we are supporting this renewable energy agenda. I would be very happy to hear more examples how we can be less bureaucratic. I know we are bureaucratic in a way, but I mean, we have large financial volumes. We have a huge fiduciary responsibility. Of course, we have reporting obligations towards the German Parliament, towards the public, the technical and financial agencies that are implementing on behalf of the ministry, of course, have reporting obligations towards us. So yes, it's a long value chain, if you will. And of course, there is bureaucracy involved, but we have, as I said, these fiduciary responsibilities. So let us know where we can be smarter and leaner. was very happy to hear that Germany was considered to be quite advanced in the way we do the development cooperation on the government side. I have done that several times, committee mix or intergovernmental negotiations. And I feel that we are guests in the country, welcomed guests, but we are by no means in a position to sort of dictate our agenda, which we would also not want to do, because we believe that the old world of ownership is extremely important in order to get things done. If we would impose something from outside, but the Senegalese government wouldn't be okay with it, it's a recipe for disaster. So we are very focused in understanding how we can align our development cooperation priorities with the priorities of the Senegalese government. We include more NGOs and academia, just as well as private sector. I think we would never oppose that. As we are here today with APRI to discuss all this, I think it shows that we do have high interest in having this exchange, just as well with working with and through NGOs, private sector. When we are in Senegal, we will speak on the investment for Senegal fair. So we hope to have a lot of private sector engagement there. Last point, as you are aware, we are very focused on pharma, supporting the Senegalese pharma sector. And of course, that is a private sector engagement that we are trying to booster there. That's one of the big learnings after the COVID pandemic events, that we need to support African solutions also in the pharma sector. Now my time, I think, is about to run out, and I haven't spoken much about Ghana. Excuse me for that, Bright, sorry. The comments I got from my colleague, we can maybe also share that later and have a follow-up there. Towards, we still believe in technical and vocational training. We're very engaged there. And second word on Ghana, the debt crisis there, of course, was also a huge impediment to more private and public investment. So we need to work on that end as well. Excuse me for being brief in some parts and maybe too long in others, but I'm also happy to answer questions and happy to have a follow-up as well. Thanks so much.
Right. Thank you so much, Dr. Braune. I just want to flag that, I mean, if there are other aspects regarding, you know, your response to the Ghanaian part, this of course can be woven into the remainder of the conversation, right? So I think what we've just heard is a response that also drew attention to some of the debates and issues on the German side. You spoke of what you called a long, you know, let's call it cooperation supply chain, right, on the German end, that also requires all manner of, you know, reporting. You highlighted the issue of transparency there, but you asked, okay, what could be done better, right? And this is the question that I would just immediately pass on to our panelists, who I know in their research, both for these papers and more generally, have specifically also looked at this exact question. And I think, again, before the bilaterals now, as you also described, Dr. Braune, as German development cooperation is in flux, I think now is a very good time to hear from our panelists on some answers to this particular question before we can then still move on and dive deeper into some of the more specific policy issues raised. So maybe Sokhna, if you would like to go first on this one.
Right. What could be done better? That would be a long discussion, I'm guessing, and a back and forth. But I think very immediately what we could think about is mechanisms to, how do you call it? to reduce the distance between our between our administrations, if I'm speaking on a very bilateral level. Something else, and this is something that I have personally noted when we visited different agencies, maybe Kwesi could also attest to that, but the language barrier when it comes to reporting is very, I understand that this is Germans' ways and politics, but also the people working within this setting who are working locally sometimes feel like there's a delay for them to get certain information, and this might delay their understanding of the impact that their work is having. So I believe there is that, and also to reduce the distance, as I said, between the administrations. But we could talk more about it, obviously, of course. Thank you very much.
Yes, please, Bright, come in.
Okay, I'm going to follow Dr. Ndiaye's lead and say, narrowing it down to the specific issue around economic diplomacy and industrial cooperation between the two regions. I mean, Dr. Brown is absolutely right that the debt situation in Ghana was an impediment. Part of that was because the instruments were too tied to what you might call the sovereign ceiling. You know, if it's all about the government's creditworthiness, then naturally you get overloaded and oversaturated, and you start to have these severe problems. But the beauty of some of the export credit strategies is to be able to enable private sector in Ghana, not all of whom are tied to the sovereign ceiling, to come into play. So what are so that the innovation around the guarantee structure can be such that you have the German side reducing the risk for the German private sector. But when it comes to the Ghanaian side, you don't need the Ghanaian government to be the anchor, to be the credit anchor. You know, if we do that, and if you think of it in terms of regional strategies, so for instance, let's say the African Development Bank, that's the anchor on the Ghanaian private sector side, then notwithstanding the sovereign issues we have with debt in Ghana, you can still do deals. Now, my thinking is we need this new framework of creative thinking about the financing dynamics and the financing dimension that is not locked to some of the legacy systems. Because if it's the Ghanaian government all the time, and if until the Ghanaian government gets its books in order, we can't move, then we're going to be waiting for a long time, because we do have this procyclicality problem where problems kind of generate problems. So my thinking is we have to be creative about the nature of the relationships and bringing in other sectors, the private sector, the multilateral development banks, the development financial institutions, and the ecosystems. The second one is to think very hard about what I would call corridor finance. So there's a little known problem, which is that for a lot of infrastructure to be paid back, you know, if I borrow to build a road, for it to pay back, I need to build other kinds of infrastructure around the road. Otherwise, I can't pay back because the road doesn't make money. So I have to connect it maybe to a logistical belt, and maybe to a horticultural growing zone. And these multiplicity of infrastructural components, we call a corridor. And then you potentially could pay back on the infrastructure loans. The problem, though, is that due to poor synchronization, often individual projects within a cluster do not de-risk the other projects. They amplify the risk because there's a suspicion that the other projects will not be delivered. So the ones that get delivered are not as profitable as they should be due to demand compression and several other factors. So rather than lowering the cost of capital, they magnify the cost of capital. So this corridor financing problem has to be fixed with bespoke solutions. And the current global development finance institutions don't understand this. So a lot of the time you have the planning on the one side, the financing on the other side, and most of the financing is tied to discrete projects. And due to lack of synchronization, you don't get delivered. If we keep doing that, we're going to see what happened in the 60s and the 70s. The Europeans came in, invested in infrastructure. Africans couldn't pay. That led to a debt crisis. We had the Brady bonds and all of these things. The Europeans then shifted away from hard infrastructure. The Chinese then come in, learn the same lesson a few decades later. They move away from hard infrastructure. The Arabs are now, the Gulf are now in, and they are learning the lesson, but they're not going to learn it before they run out of money for Africa in that sense. So we need to have this learning cycle in which we get creative. Otherwise, we just keep repeating the same problem. We go into Africa, we put in infrastructure, payback is not working, so we restructure the loans. That increases risk. We move away from infrastructure. We try to fix the soft things. There has to be synchronization. Hard and soft development, synchronized. Corridor versus discrete projects, synchronized. Private and public, synchronized. And I think this will require creativity.
Right. Thank you very much for that. And before I give the word back to Dr. Braune, I'd like to maybe pick up on an earlier strand of the discussion to just weave it into what we've just heard, which is the structure and architecture of some of the project logics, right, with which, of course, German Development Corporation operates. Yes, there are zones, there are sectors, there is, an attempt at synchronization. But I think what we just heard also points us to some of the more fundamental problems that are associated with the, let's say, project-based logic of some of these interventions, right? And if we tie that in with what we have heard from Bright earlier in terms of the necessity to, let's say, be more nimble, I think I heard you speak of policy impatience, right? The need to both integrate and think of these things in synchronizing across the whole corridor, for example, right? But also being able in the project design then to blend public and private finance in a new way. It seems to be creating, or at least sketching out, right, an idea for a very different kind of, let's say, architecture and approach that also requires a very different kind of cooperation and coordination. Now, based on what we've heard from the German context, of course, these are very important ideas, but they're also coming at a time when German Development Corporation is in itself in flux. So my question to you based on this, Mr. Braune, is do you see windows of opportunity in the fact that there is flux, in the fact that, as you said, there are contradictory dynamics where German development budget is both shrinking and now the largest bilateral budget in the world? There are negotiations about new understandings and roles for German Development Corporation, debates within Germany, right? So where would you see potential areas of synergy or ways in which some of these debates, which are often reactive, right, could be connected to some of the proactive design questions that have just been raised?
Thank you. Yeah, let me maybe start with the question on the current opportunities. There are definitely windows of opportunities on the overall design of development cooperation from Germany. At the moment, as I said, we have this reform agenda ongoing. And while the ministry hasn't started an official consultancy process or public reflection process, this is known because the minister has communicated that she is working on this reform agenda. So this is not a secret that I'm sharing here, but it's a political agenda. And of course, governments, but also academia are invited to sort of get themselves into the picture with ideas. And of course, when we speak with our partner government officials in our conversations, we bring them in on this topic and ask for their comments and ideas on how they want our development cooperation to look in 5 or 10 years. So this is an ongoing process, and like any political process, there are some structured elements in it, and there are some sort of informal elements in it. I maybe want to throw in a little skepticism in what direction this reform process is going, because our political landscape, of course, is, and that's when I spoke about the pressure development cooperation was under from the right wing. That led to a refocus on German interests in development cooperation. Why are we doing this for Germany? What's in it for us? Sort of this question. That doesn't mean that we shrink the budget to zero, but it means that in what also my colleague Sokhna pointed out, let's work with less strings and let us be more autonomous as the partners in our national government strategies. I see a contradicting trend, again, referring to German interests. So I think that will be a policy discussion that we need to bring to the table. I don't think it's a contradiction that is that we cannot solve. The answer lies in this famous phrase of win-win, gagnant-gagnant. And German development cooperation, a win-win situation is what we need. And often we were very unclear about our own interests in our development programs. Why are you giving us 10 million? Why do you do that? And we say, yeah, we believe in SDG 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever. And for partners that are very trade-oriented, that's not clear when we don't speak about our own interests in development cooperation. So I think there's a huge opportunity in it as well, as long as the balance of interests remains fair and clear. Let me say a word on synchronization, please, because I believe that is extremely important. Bright mentioned that, and he gave the historic examples. I think that is an extremely important political agenda point, to have synchronization in international partnership, cooperation, however you want to call it. But it's not new. I want to recall the APRI action agenda on aid coordination. It shows that the contradicting powers that are working on an international agenda make it very difficult to synchronize international cooperation and aid. And that refers to what I spoke earlier, national interests. So you have to be, if you truly want to work coordinated, coherent, and well, coordinated, coherent, and well coordinated, you have to move your own interests into the second row, and you have to be very open to take Finland's and Belgium's and Ghana's fictive example on board. And that is really difficult for political actors to do. That's why the synchronization or coordination had so many issues. I would love to come back to Sokhna's point to reduce distance, but maybe I can do that in the next round.
Well, please feel free to
go
ahead. Yeah.
Then reduce distance. That was Sokhna's first point on how we can improve our cooperation. That is the general trend, reducing distance. In my understanding, that would mean we give more power, decision-making power to our embassies and to German development actors in the partner countries. Evolution could be one word of it, and that is the general trend. So here at headquarters, of course, we are still responsible for budget and strategy, but the implementing authorities go more and more in the direction of our I don't like the word field offices, but the agencies in the partner countries and the German embassy that coordinates them, the German development agencies. There's a very clear trend in that direction, and that should reduce distance. So there's more engagement in the capitals, in Dhaka or Accra in our cases. Yeah, the language barrier, pardon our French, but why don't you learn more German? No, language is always an issue, but I think, Sokhna, maybe you can clarify, you didn't refer to the language as such, but sort of the systems and how they are communicating, so the cultural aspect of language. That is an issue. That is a constant issue that we are aware of, but it's sort of still very needed to understand more of the social fabric of a society in which we work. As you pointed out, I was in Senegal for 3 years, and I learned maybe to understand that there are different layers in a society. It's the same in Germany, but in Senegal, I learned to also deconstruct a little bit in the country. But after 3 years, you're just at the scratching the surface. So yeah, this language barrier definitely is a point. And that's why I also believe in this devolution of implementing authority to the partner countries. I leave it there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I would invite the panelists to, again, respond to that, and maybe in the last stretch also pick up on any of the issues that we've briefly touched upon that is important for either of you to also still raise in this discussion with Dr. Brauner. I would like to just throw in, my little comment into the ring about the question of the horizon of German development cooperation, where we've now heard about, political debates, but also pressure, you mentioned it directly, from the right, that is about, questioning, the actual sense of this whole undertaking, questioning budgets, questioning outcomes, and raising the question of the interest of Germany and Germany's economy, how is it served, right? And what I want to point out here is that when we have these debates, I believe there's a way to have them in a reactive way, right? Where you then defend maybe the status quo or where it could go and should go in the future. Or there could be a proactive stance, right? That is about maybe a longer time horizon, that is about, issues of multilateralism and the political and social context in which economic interests can or cannot thrive or even be articulated, right? So the point there then is that rather than having a zero-sum game where there has to be like an immediate euro value, right, that is at the end of any input in cooperation, one could ask, well, what is there for German international interests, even German economic interests to be had, right? If we reduce our interaction in the world to direct, immediate outputs, right? Where then if we raise issues of, you mentioned it earlier, in the context of COVID, right? If we look at issues of global health, if we look at issues of climate change, and if we look at the issue that was raised here earlier, which is migration and demographic trends in Europe, compared to Africa, I think we see a whole range of issues, right, that clearly require different and maybe longer horizons of cooperation, right? But just as a comment, please, Sokhna and Bright, feel free to use the remainder of this conversation to, set your own priority in this last round of interaction. So I will invite Sokhna to begin.
Thank you, Kwesi. I would like probably to point that Germany is an important partner for Senegal. It's an ally for Senegal, but Senegal can also be a strategic partner to Germany. And I think it is because Senegal is still a very stable democracy in the region, and it still can act as a, how do you say, a tampon, like a intermediary in helping German positioning in the West African region. So I believe it is important to using the words of Dr. Bright, we need to be creative about how we approach in the future this relationship. And this is relevant for the reform agenda that is being thought about. And just to cite what the former foreign ministry said last year in Dakar during the visit, it is saying that it is now a time for mutual exchange. Mutual exchange, we are at a point, we are poised to listen to one another and learn from one another in order to create new forms of cooperation. And the fact that new forms of cooperation was mentioned is huge. It is crucial because we need new forms of cooperation. The world, the geopolitical landscape is fast changing, and this is the time for both Germany and Senegal to position themselves. And we hope the positioning of Germany will be not only for German interest, but for the interest of the at the global level, because it is now a key player for these countries that need and develop. When I think of development, I don't just think of the grand scheme of being developed. It's the lady that needs to go to take her child to the hospital. This is development. The child that needs to go to school. This is development. Electrification, energy, etc. So in thinking about development, in thinking about reforms, we think about how making one person's life better will be better for everybody at a global level. So this is maybe my call of her to the German authorities and to the Senegalese authorities to really dig deep and identify the middle ground that will be both beneficial for Germany and for Senegal, and to work together towards providing a better life for everybody, basically. Thank you.
Thanks. So I will touch on two issues that were raised by Dr. Brown. One being the issue around development aid and its future, and the second being about the alignment between global aid or international aid, however we put it, and Germany's strategic interests. On aid, there are number of key principles that I think serve us well when we analyze that phenomenon. The first principle is to be aware of how small it is in the international financial scheme of things, and that is actually a tragedy and in some ways also an interesting dynamic. So today, international development aid is about $200 billion. I try to give people an impression of what that means in terms of global exchange by explaining that is less than 2 times the amount of money the rich world spends on chocolates. So it's really small when you think of the other massive international flow of resources around the world, forex, commodities, etc. International money is a really small thing. The second thing is that even within that $200 billion, notwithstanding cuts, which are regrettable, there is still a lot that can be unlocked within the current system if you consider the fact that for a very long time, commitments and disbursements have kept diverging, So of the money that, the World Bank commits to Ghana, if you move from that level of commitments and start to analyze the level of disbursements and effective disbursements, you get to maybe about a quarter of that money actually moving through. And the reason is because, like Dr. Ndiaye pointed out, the bureaucratic machinery is never really revamped. There's a lot of attention paid on to the politics of aid and that kind of thing, but the policies, the underlying policies of how you do aid, that is left to a very small group of specialists. So most political leaders are not aware of what it takes to actually unlock an aid project. And we haven't done much thinking about how you do that for a long time. So there are a lot of projects that gets, developed. I'll give you a very practical example with the European program in Ghana, something we call the Global Gateway, which is Europe's attempts to rival the Chinese Belt and Road. And you look at the individual projects and you look at the disbursement rate and you look at the, execution rate, extremely slow. I think there's one project in pharmaceuticals, about 5 million euros. And for 3 years, it's just nothing, movement. So that tells you that even when there's commitment, this $1 billion, getting the money through is a huge opportunity for all of us to improve because there's some money. The money is not moving. So what do we do about that? And I think there is some level of opportunity around politicizing some of those issues, which we don't politicize at all. So we focus only about the commitment level, the label, the envelope, how much money and things like that. The second piece is that if you then move from there to say, okay, how should Germany frame the engagement? I think the last thing you want to do is to confuse humanitarian aid with what we are talking about. So what we are talking about is not humanitarian aid. It's not about, poor people, who have been denied access to the most basics of life and how the Germany help. That's important, but that's such a tiny piece of the conversation. What we are talking about is that Germany has problems on its own. It's got to a point in the world where the massive export machine that they assembled in the 50s and the 60s appear increasingly under threat. Africa, in this case, Ghana, has challenges, around being able to improve on the productivity of its transformation agenda. Now, how do we work together in that kind of world? In this kind of world where both Europe and Africa are under huge threat from emerging powers. And the thinking around this cannot be that there should be handouts from Germany. It's not about handouts from Germany. It's about two regions of the world, Africa and Europe, that to my mind are under massive pressure from the Gulf, from Asia, from the Americas, and we are beginning to become laggards. And how do we reorganize our relationship to move forward in a world that is not waiting for us? That really is the conversation. And I think framing it properly in Germany is going to be very critical to building the momentum on the political side that we need to advance the conversation.
Right. Thank you. Yeah, I believe on that note, that forward-looking note, we have to bring this conversation to an end for now, bearing in mind that as this conversation now closes, the broader exchange on these issues, to think that we have put on the table here, that we have heard from our authors, is only beginning and should intensify in the next month as we are moving towards the German-Senegalese and also German-Ghanaian bilaterals. So with that said, I would like to really thank all of you for your attendance, for sharing your thoughts, for your willingness to engage. And I would like to invite you to continue this conversation with us. We'll find other channels to keep engaging on these issues, especially also when the final versions of the papers are out. So with that, thank you to our panelists. Thank you to everybody in the audience. Yeah, this conversation is coming to an end. The dialogue on the issues on the table must continue and intensify. So with that, yeah, wish you a good rest of the day. And yeah, let's keep in touch. Let's keep the conversation going.